No one expected it. A routine engagement turned into a national spectacle when Duchess Sophie, normally composed and calculated, broke down in front of rolling cameras. Her voice cracked, her hands trembled, and then came the haunting words, "I can't protect Catherine from this anymore." But what exactly was this? And why now? What triggered a woman known for her stoicism to publicly crumble? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began like any other engagement, a polished appearance by the Duchess of Edinburgh at a Children's Foundation event. But the composure quickly slipped. As Sophie attempted to address the gathered press, something cracked. Her sentence broke mid-thought, and what followed was silence pregnant, piercing silence. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked beyond the cameras, beyond the stage, as if seeing something no one else could. "I can't protect Catherine from this anymore," she finally whispered, and the world froze. The footage spread across the globe like wildfire. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a message, a coded scream buried in royal protocol, exploding onto the world stage with devastating vulnerability. Within hours, every media outlet was dissecting her words, framing them as either a moment of emotional exhaustion or a deliberate act of rebellion. But to those who truly understood the undercurrents of the palace, this wasn't about Sophie losing control. This was about Sophie letting go of a burden she had carried in silence for far too long. For over 2 decades, Sophie had been the embodiment of discretion, loyal to the late Queen, loyal to the firm, loyal even to those who undermined her husband's quiet influence. But something changed when Catherine entered the inner circle. A bond formed unspoken, undeniable. They weren't just sisters-in-law. They were survivors of a palace that often devoured the very women it paraded. Sophie had taken it upon herself to act as shield, strategist, and silent witness to Catherine's rise, and the dangers that came with it. Yet, as the tides within the monarchy began shifting with new power plays, media manipulations, and internal rivalries, Sophie's role changed from protector to prisoner of the truth. And that pressure, compounded over years, finally reached a boiling point. What stunned insiders even more was the palace's immediate silence. No damage control statement, no carefully worded clarification, just an echo chamber of unanswered questions. For an institution notorious for its rapid-fire spin and protective messaging, the lack of response was deafening. Whispers among staff suggested orders had been given to let her hang herself with her own words, while others claimed senior aides were scrambling behind the scenes, unsure how to spin a moment that cut through every layer of royal mystique. What Sophie revealed in those 8 words was more than pain, it was a coded warning, an acknowledgement that Catherine, the woman many see as the future queen, was facing something far more sinister than public pressure or tabloid attacks. Something that couldn't be explained away with polished statements or silken denials. And for Sophie, the woman who had stood beside her every step of the way, the cost of silence had finally become too high. But to understand Sophie's emotional implosion, we must go back to the secret she's been guarding for years, a truth so volatile it could collapse the very foundation of the monarchy. Behind the hedges of Windsor, away from the ears of staff and advisors, 2 women made a pact, one of loyalty, protection, and truth. Catherine, then still the Duchess of Cambridge, needed someone. Sophie stepped forward, but this pact came at a cost, and now it's beginning to unravel. It was never meant to be known. In the dead of night, with the palace asleep and the corridors silent, Catherine slipped into Bagshot Park more times than anyone would suspect. Under the shroud of secrecy, she met Sophie not as royals, but as women. Sophie had lived through the quiet brutality of the firm. She knew how smiles could be weapons, how titles came with invisible chains. Catherine was still new, still raw, her elegance masking the storm of pressure she had been thrown into. And in those private meetings, a sisterhood was forged, a sacred alliance formed not from duty, but from survival. Sophie, with her years of calculated silence and behind-the-scenes influence, became more than just a guide. She became a lifeline. She offered Catherine more than advice, she offered her a promise. I'll never let them do to you what they did to Diana. Words that carried the weight of grief, of history, of royal ghosts that still haunted the halls of Buckingham Palace. That moment wasn't scripted. It wasn't strategic, it was desperate. Because both women knew something that no royal biographer would ever print. The crown didn't protect its women, it used them. And if left unchecked, it would consume Catherine too. But word of their growing closeness didn't stay buried for long. Whispers started circulating through the palace, servants speaking in hushed tones, advisors noting schedule overlaps, senior royals quietly expressing discomfort. Paranoia spread like smoke. Who knew? Who had been watching? More importantly, who wanted the alliance destroyed? It wasn't just about power anymore, it was about control. And to some, Sophie's quiet defiance was starting to look like a threat. Still, Sophie stood firm on the outside, obedient as ever on the inside, building a firewall around Catherine's rising star. But the weight of it all began to wear her down. For over a decade, she absorbed the slur. Ites, the political daggers, the subtle attempts to separate them. Every event, every speech, every photograph was curated to suggest distance. And yet, the bond remained. Until recently, something changed. Catherine grew quieter. Sophie noticed the guarded looks, the encrypted texts, the way Catherine's schedule was altered without her knowledge. Then came the chilling realization. The pact they made, once a shield, had now made them both targets. And Sophie was no longer sure if she could keep her promise. The final blow came from a direction Sophie hadn't expected. Someone dangerously close to King Charles, a confidant, perhaps even a blood relation, began to undermine their communications. A message Catherine had sent never arrived. A call Sophie placed went unanswered. Meetings were postponed without explanation. It wasn't just interference, it was sabotage. And it confirmed what Sophie had feared for years. The attack wouldn't come from the press, it wouldn't come from critics or exiled royals. It would come from within the heart of the palace itself. But the real danger wasn't outside the palace, it was lurking within. And Sophie knew the storm was coming. Inside Clarence House, a confidential strategy session bore a code name that now sends chills down the spine: Operation Silence. Designed not to eliminate Catherine, but to isolate her, to neutralize her growing influence. Sophie learned of it too late, or perhaps just in time. It began with whispers. Occur! iOS omission here, a delayed press release there. At first, Sophie chalked it up to coincidence. After all, the royal machine was slow, often tangled in its own traditions. But then came the patterns. Catherine's appearances suddenly overshadowed by Camilla's, media photographers redirected at the last minute, speeches quietly rewritten without approval. And then, the name surfaced: Operation Silence. Sophie first encountered the phrase in a discarded email she was never meant to see, a briefing thread sent to a senior aide, marked urgent, strategy realignment. The content was vague, the language sanitized, but the implications, devastating. The documents weren't direct, they never would be. But between the lines, buried in coded phrases like narrative management and visibility restructuring, was a chilling truth. Catherine wasn't being supported. She was being strategically suppressed. Her rising popularity, once seen as a beacon for the monarchy's future, was now considered a threat, particularly to those who feared becoming obsolete. And in this new power equation, Camilla's presence was increasingly eclipsed. The contrast was stark. Where Catherine's engagements drew genuine public warmth, Camilla's were often tepid, even strained. It created tension not just in the tabloids but behind palace walls. Senior courtiers, some of whom had built their careers propping up Charles and Camilla's image, were allegedly enlisted to tilt the balance. They orchestrated press blackouts, repositioned seating arrangements at televised events, and ensured that Catherine was always either too early or too late to be the focal point. What should have been royal choreography became a calculated effort in marginalization. And the worst part? Catherine played along, gracious, composed, unaware, or unwilling to accept that she was being quietly erased. Sophie, however, noticed everything. When she found a second document, one marked confidential, and left unattended in a locked drawer during a briefing she was meant to attend. It was no longer speculation, it was strategy. The memo laid out a plan to reshape public favor, citing Catherine's outsized presence as a potential destabilizing element to the transition narrative. In simpler terms, she was too beloved, and that love had to be managed, redirected, or neutralized. That's when Sophie tried to fight back. She confronted two senior AIDS people she had once trusted. Their response was chilling, blank expressions, polite dismissals, and behind her back, whispers labeling her as overly emotional, reactive, and politically naive. The psychological warfare wasn't just directed at Catherine anymore. It had expanded. Sophie found herself slowly uninvited from certain discussions, her input subtly disregarded, her appearances deliberately overlapped with others to dilute her influence. The isolation was surgical. Sophie realized this wasn't simply a matter of jealousy or protocol. It was warfare. Silent, well-dressed, and devastating. And while Catherine continued to smile through the manipulation, Sophie's fury mounted. Her attempts to reach the king were redirected, her scheduled time with Catherine was quietly reduced, and more than once, her inquiries about internal changes were met with stern warnings masked as royal decorum. But as whispers turned into warnings, Sophie faced an unthinkable realization: this wasn't just about public perception. It was about Catherine's safety. A veteran bodyguard confided in Sophie that security protocols around Catherine had inexplicably changed. Routes altered, staff reshuffled, cameras disabled. It was subtle but deliberate. Was this incompetence or sabotage from within? At first, it sounded like nothing more than procedural tightening, routine adjustments passed off as modernization. But then the shifts started piling up. Sophie was the first to notice how Catherine's once familiar protection detail began vanishing, one by one, replaced by faces she didn't recognize. When she asked why Catherine's trusted security chief had been reassigned, no one had a clear answer. Even more concerning, Catherine herself hadn't been informed. That's when Sophie reached out directly, contacting the former officer under the guise of a casual check-in. What she received was not just concern, it was fear. The man spoke in hushed tones, his voice tight, his words careful. He told her he'd been removed for asking the wrong queue. Questions. Then he vanished. No forwarding number, no way to follow up. And it didn't end there. Panic buttons installed in Catherine's private quarters meant to alert nearby guards in the event of any threat had reportedly been removed without her knowledge. Catherine only discovered it after attempting to test one late one evening. When Sophie heard, she was speechless. This wasn't just careless, it was calculated. Meanwhile, emergency response drills were quietly cancelled. CCTV feeds mysteriously malfunctioned during key events. On 3 separate occasions, Catherine was rerouted mid-journey to avoid protest risk. Yet Sophie later discovered there had been no security threat logged. These weren't coincidences, they were chess moves. What chilled Sophie to the bone was the emergence of a name buried in a security ledger, someone listed only as a private consultant brought in under Camilla's office. No last name, no photo ID. But wherever this shadowy advisor appeared, changes followed, subtle at first, then more severe. The new consultant reportedly had influence over logistics, staffing schedules, and even access to Catherine's daily itinerary. Who authorized this? No one would say. Every inquiry Sophie made met a dead end, every conversation laced with uncomfortable pauses. People weren't just avoiding her, they were afraid. Determined to uncover the truth, Sophie took matters into her own hands. Using quiet connections within the estate's operations team, she uncovered that on 3 occasions during major public events, cameras positioned to monitor entrances and exits had been switched off for brief, unexplained windows. Not in random places, but specifically in the zones where Catherine would be moving. When Sophie pressed harder, a technician admitted he had been told the request came from above, but no written record existed. That phrase haunted Sophie, from above. In a world where hierarchy was everything, it could only mean one thing: someone with power was orchestrating this. It was the final pattern that confirmed Sophie's worst fear. Catherine wasn't being protected, She was being exposed. Someone within the system was intentionally dismantling her safety net, brick by brick, leaving her vulnerable under the guise of royal protocol. For Sophie, it was a betrayal unlike any other, not just of Catherine, but of everything the monarchy claimed to stand for. Her hands trembled not out of confusion, but out of rage. And then came the final straw, an incident that left no room for doubt. Catherine was in real danger, and Sophie was out of time. It was supposed to be a simple tour of an art wing, but when staff returned to check on Catherine, the doors were locked, her security was absent, and she was nowhere to be found. When Sophie arrived on the scene, her scream could be heard down the corridor. That morning had been uneventful: scheduled appearances, press moments, a quiet walkthrough of a newly restored art gallery within one of the private royal estates. Catherine was meant to make a brief stop, offer a few words, then move on to her next engagement. But time passed. Staff grew uneasy. The door to the gallery remained shut. When they finally forced it open, what they found was silence. No movement, no voices, no Catherine. Her phone was on a bench. Her security was inexplicably missing. Panic spread fast. Within minutes, Sophie was on site, her face tight with dread, her instincts screaming that something was terribly wrong. They found Catherine tucked into a back alcove, alone, tear-streaked, trembling, her words barely audible. She wasn't physically harmed, but something had shattered. Her expression was vacant, her voice flat. "They locked the door," she said softly, and no one came. There had been no panic button, no escort, no emergency response. For over 30 minutes, the woman destined to be queen had been completely unprotected, and no one had any explanation. Security logs were incomplete, radio chatter between officers had untraceable gaps, and most disturbingly, surveillance footage for that period had been mysteriously wiped. Sophie's blood boiled. She demanded answers, an internal inquiry, accountability. But her fury was met with bureaucratic silence. The Palace Communications Office issued a short, rehearsed statement about logistical miscommunication and a temporary lapse in personnel coordination. No apology, no follow-up, just silence again, but behind closed doors, Sophie was relentless. She called in favors, pressured aides, contacted senior advisors she'd once trusted. Still, doors began closing. Conversations stopped. Whispers spread that Sophie had overreacted and was letting her emotions interfere with protocol. And then, in a moment of quiet rage, Sophie confronted Catherine, directly demanding to know what had happened in that room. Catherine didn't cry. She didn't lash out. She simply leaned forward and whispered 6 words that changed everything. "They wanted me to crack, Sophie." Those words hit harder than any confession. It wasn't fear. It wasn't confusion. It was clarity. Catherine had seen it in their eyes, the hesitation, the delay, the eerie absence of help. This hadn't been a mistake. It had been a message, a warning, or worse, a test. For Sophie, something inside finally snapped. The years she had spent walking the line between duty and protection, diplomacy and defiance, meant nothing now. She had tried to play the game from within, to hold the line quietly, but this was unforgivable. Catherine had been left to suffer alone, afraid, abandoned. And if that moment hadn't broken her completely, it had come dangerously close. Sophie's silence, her careful restraint, her strategic patience crumbled in an instant. What they had done, or allowed to happen, crossed a threshold from political sabotage into something far more sinister. And that rage wasn't going to stay contained anymore. But what Sophie didn't expect was what Catherine would reveal next, a truth that shattered everything Sophie thought she was protecting. Late one night, Catherine handed Sophie a small leather-bound journal. Inside, years of pain, manipulation and betrayal had been documented: every meeting, every threat, every silence from those who should have defended her. It was more than a diary. It was a warning. Sophie had never seen Catherine like that before. There was no ceremony, no pleasantries, no smiles to hide behind. Just trembling hands, eyes that had cried too much, and a voice stripped of all performance. "You need to read this," Catherine said, placing the book into her palms like she was passing over the last thing she had left. Sophie didn't open it immediately. She waited until she was alone. and when she did, what she found inside was a map of a royal war no one had spoken of publicly, a war Catherine had been quietly fighting, all while cameras flashed and titles glittered. The pages weren't polished. They were raw. Some were smeared with ink, some torn as if written in fury. But every entry was precise, calculated, devastating. The first shock came quickly, notes detailing how Catherine's queen consort responsibilities had slowly been stripped away, not by accident, but by design. Catherine outlined the subtle ways Camilla's camp undermined her. Events Catherine was meant to headline were quietly reassigned. Briefings she once received directly were rerouted through third parties. Photographers were positioned to favor Camilla, not the future queen. It wasn't just competition, it was obstruction. And the higher Catherine rose in the public's esteem, the more intense the internal sabotage became. She had written, "Every time they clap for me, someone behind those walls sharpens another knife." But perhaps the most heartbreaking pages were not about public appearances, they were about William. In entry after entry, Catherine described his inner torment, how he tried to balance the crown's expectations with loyalty to her, how he'd started pulling away, sometimes without realizing it. She wrote of his silence when she needed his voice, of his absence when she needed his arms. "He loves me, but he's been raised to protect the crown above all else," one entry read. "Even if it destroys us both." Sophie sat in stunned silence for hours, turning each page with shaking hands. There were entries that revealed Catherine's exhaustion, emotional, physical, spiritual. Notes describing sleepless nights, panic attacks, her growing fear that even her children were no longer beyond the reach of the palace machine. "I've begun locking their bedroom door," she wrote. "It makes no sense, but it's the only thing that helps me sleep." Sophie wept not because she was surprised, but because she hadn't seen it sooner. Or maybe she had, and just couldn't admit it. But it was the final line, scrawled in trembling ink on the last page. That gutted her completely. "If Sophie reads this, it means I failed." That sentence shattered something deep inside. It wasn't just a message, it was a cry. Catherine had entrusted Sophie not just with the truth, but with the burden of what to do next. The cost of silence was now too high. The crown had become a cage, and the only person brave enough to open the door was running out of time. Fueled by anguish and desperation, Sophie made a decision that would risk everything she had built within the royal machine. Dressed not as a duchess, but as a mother and ally, Sophie entered the king's private chamber and placed the journal on his desk. "If you won't protect her," she said, "I will expose the ones who failed her." What followed was not royal diplomacy, it was war in whispers. Sophie didn't knock. She walked straight in, carrying the weight of every page, every tear-stained entry, and every silence she'd been forced to endure. King Charles looked up from his papers, surprised but not entirely unprepared. For a moment the room held its breath. Then Sophie dropped the journal between them like a detonator. She didn't ask. She warned. Her voice steady but soaked in fury, she laid it out plainly. Catherine was being targeted, stripped, erased and abandoned. And the palace, the very institution that had sworn to shield her, was complicit in her slow undoing. Sophie demanded that it stop. She demanded protection. She demanded the truth. Charles listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. But Sophie saw the flicker there, just for a second. Not confusion, not outrage. Recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that somewhere deep inside he knew. Whether he'd chosen to look away or had been kept in the dark himself no longer mattered. What mattered was his response, and it came in a single chilling sentence. "You're playing a dangerous game, Sophie." It wasn't just a threat, it was a reminder that behind every wall of Buckingham, loyalty had a price, and even those closest to the throne were never beyond its reach. Sophie didn't flinch. What Charles didn't know was that she had come prepared. In her coat pocket, tucked beneath her scarf, a tiny device recorded every word exchanged between them. She had learned too well how quickly words could be twisted, how easily intentions could be recast as hysteria. This time, she wasn't leaving anything to chance. The fallout was immediate. Within 48 hours, Sophie's scheduled appearances were cancelled with no explanation. Her name disappeared from briefings, invitations were revoked, loyal aides were reassigned without warning. A silent campaign of erasure began, The very same tactics they had used against Catherine now turning inward. But the difference this time, Sophie was ready, and she didn't retreat. She returned to Catherine's side not with fear but with fire. The first time Catherine saw her again, she didn't speak. She just held Sophie's hand, long and tight. No words were needed. Gratitude didn't have to be spoken when it was written all over your face. But the cost was mounting. Allies were vanishing. Pressure was building. The walls were closing in, and both women knew they were now part of something bigger than protection. They were in a fight for survival inside an institution built to silence them. But even Sophie didn't anticipate what would come next, the palace's counterattack, designed to break her spirit in the most public way possible. The cameras weren't just there by accident. The setting, the crowd, the topic, it was all calculated. Royal handlers knew Sophie was close to breaking, and they wanted the world to see it. The breakdown wasn't spontaneous. It was engineered. In the days leading up to the charity event, subtle red flags began to appear, but none of them loud enough to stop the train already in motion. Sophie's security briefings were suddenly cancelled without reason. Her private requests for updated talking points were ignored. Support staff she trusted were reassigned, and in their place came unfamiliar faces with blank expressions. She was isolated cordially, professionally, but unmistakably. Every hour, another layer of support peeled away. When Sophie tried to ask questions, she was met with kind smiles and vague assurances. Just protocol adjustments, they said, but the pattern was impossible to ignore. She was being set up, not physically, psychologically. By the morning of the engagement, the pressure was unbearable. Sophie hadn't slept. Her mind was spinning from the confrontation with Charles, the weight of Catherine's journal, and the walls that were closing in around her. Still, she showed up, dressed and poised, determined to deliver. But what she didn't know was that her microphone had been turned on early, long before she stepped up to the podium. Hers was the only one live. Every tremor in her voice, every intake of breath, every pause, it was all being recorded, broadcast and captured. The questions from reporters were unusually pointed, too polished to be random. The crowd had been strategically placed, with media representatives she didn't recognize occupying prime positions. And then, just as she began to speak, something in her snapped. The weight of years of silence, of protection, of suppressed fury surged forward, and Sophie broke. The words came out cracked, strained, haunted. "I can't protect Catherine from this anymore." A pause, a hush, then a sea of camera shutters as if they had been waiting for that exact moment. And they had. Within 20 minutes, the footage was already in the hands of select tabloid outlets. Headlines were drafted before Sophie had even returned to her car. One senior insider would later confirm that Camilla's communications director had been briefed in advance. "It was inevitable," he allegedly said. "We just had to make sure the timing was right." They didn't need to discredit Sophie. They needed her to discredit herself. And that's exactly what the world saw until they looked closer. Because once the dust settled, once the shock headlines faded into analysis, people began to ask questions. Why was only Sophie's mic left on? Why were so many of her events stripped from her calendar days before? Why did Palace Media act so swiftly with material that had barely aired? The pattern became undeniable. Sophie hadn't simply unraveled. She had been pushed to the edge and filmed falling. And when she realized it, the pain turned to fire. This wasn't just punishment for her defiance. It was a warning. Not to her, but to Catherine. This is what happens to the ones who speak. But Sophie's collapse wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a new resistance. One that now involved allies the palace never saw coming. Sophie's public unraveling sparked a ripple. Anne reached out. Edward started asking questions, and from the shadows even Beatrice and Eugenie voiced concern. A quiet rebellion was forming, not against the monarchy, but against what it had become. It began with a knock on Catherine's private door. Princess Anne, unannounced, unguarded, her tone quiet but firm. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. Just a simple statement: "You're not alone in this." Coming from Anne, it was monumental. She had always been the silent steel of the firm, unshakable, restrained. For her to break rank meant something deep had shifted, and it didn't stop there. Prince Edward, long underestimated, began quietly leaking internal memos correspondence that proved Sophie's events had been deliberately scrubbed from the calendar, that her mic had been switched on intentionally, and that the palace's communications team had been coordinating with tabloid editors days in advance. The paper trail, while incomplete, was damning. Beatrice and Eugenie, often neutral in public perception, began stepping away from Camilla's circle with sudden clarity. Their absence at a recent high-profile event raised eyebrows, and when asked, their spokesperson gave a rare comment: "They stand where integrity stands." It wasn't loud, but it was clear. Lines were being drawn, and within the palace itself, something even more dangerous was unfolding. Staff members, maids, assistants, private secretaries began speaking, not to the royal press office, but to independent journalists, investigative reporters, even trusted foreign correspondents. They didn't leak gossip. They leaked patterns, meeting schedules, manipulation orders, edited footage plans, each detail exposing a carefully crafted illusion. Amid the shifting tides, Sophie didn't retreat. She re-emerged, not broken, but reborn. The woman who had once stood silently beside Catherine now stood in front of her, defiant. And she wasn't alone. A quiet network was forming, weaving between official titles and private relationships, built not on tradition, but on truth. Their mission wasn't to dismantle the monarchy, it was to reclaim it from the shadows that had hijacked it, from the whispered agendas that had nearly broken its brightest light. The palace thought Sophie's breakdown would silence her. Instead, it ignited a war they can no longer control. And as for Catherine, her silence is over. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.